Hey folks, so this is Shetch. You got to bear with me on this one. I'm sitting at the desk and doing it on the laptop instead of being at the front of the board. So here's our notes 3.4. And what I want to do is, here's our standard equation, ax squared plus bx plus c. That's in standard form. And before we even get into graphing, I want to take a look at this graph here. This is Desmos. So you can see there's my standard equation right here. And watch what happens when I increase this a. All right, I'm going to increase here's a slider right over here, and I'm going to increase the a. Look at the blue standard graph as opposed to the green one. Notice it's starting to become narrower and narrower, like that. All right, so let's bring it back to the old standard graph. And this is going to deal with orientation. Whenever we have a 1, we're at a standard graph. Now watch what happens when I go between 0 and 1. Look what happens to the graph. It becomes very wide. Very wide. I'll change this to a 0.3. You can see it's becoming wider. Here's a 0.2. It's becoming wider. Here's a 0.1, even wider. Great. So that affects the graph. And notice if it's a negative, and let me get to a negative standard graph. This graph is also standard. It's just been reflected over the x-axis. And now when I increase that negative 2, 3, 4, look what happens. Again, it becomes narrow. So notice what that does to the graph. Go back to the standard -1 graph right there. There's my standard -1. And now look what happens when I go between -1 and 0. It becomes wide, wide. Oops. There it's not even a quadratic anymore. Now it becomes wide, and there it is, really wide. So that's going to affect the shape of it. That's the shape. That's what A does. So let's answer our questions on this page here. Let me blow this back up for you. And we're going to just scroll down here to the bottom. And as A, what happens to A? It slowly, as A increases, the graph gets narrower. Gets narrow. All right, and then back to a 1. As we slowly decrease it, but not below 0, the graph gets wide. Okay, so that's very important what that A does. Still being positive, but the graph gets wide. All right, let's go on to the next page. And here, let me get to the top. Yep, I guess we are at the top already. As the graph goes below 0, meaning it's negative, the graph goes down. So the value of A, that's going to affect the shape. Sorry, I didn't get it on the line. And that'll be our standard graph, a 1 or positive 1. Positive 1 or negative 1. It could become narrow when we go more than a 1, and then it also could become wide. So that's what that does, and also the orientation. And that'll affect the graph that way. The orientation just means it's going up or it's going down. So we have here becomes narrow. Let me get this here. This becomes narrow. Whenever we're more than a 1, and let me scroll this down a bit. Here we have, when it becomes a 0, between a 0 and a 1 right here, then the graph becomes wide. And I'll have a question for you at the end. When it's negative, the graph goes down. And when A turns out to be positive, it goes up. So there are all the important facts that A does. It affects the shape as well as the orientation. Okay, next question is, let's see what C does to the graph. So let me get this back to normal, back to a normal standard graph. Oops, let's get on this. Okay, so we'll get back to a regular standard graph right there. Now watch what happens what C does. When I increase C, notice what the vertex does. It goes up. And then as well as going down, when C becomes a -2, notice where the vertex is, it's going down. So let's answer those questions. Let me blow this back up for you. And again, I'm going to have 2 questions at the very end. So let me get my text box here. As the value of C increases, what happens to the graph? The vertex goes up vertically. Oops, a little bit of spelling mistake there. And I should not have that in there. Okay, and now when C becomes a negative number, this next question, the vertex goes down. Okay, and we're not really going to answer the questions for B. Let me go to the next page here. I think we might have some more or not. So the value of C affects the vertex. With greater than, it travels up. I'll use that word, travels up. And then here, it would travel down when C becomes negative. All right, now we'll get on to the next page. And this is not super important, but let's look at to see what B does. So let me get C back to its normal spot. I got it back on my right here. And we'll just call C equals to a 0 now. There's my slider. Now watch what B does. Let me close this down here. Look what happens to B. B, it's going to follow the reflection of your normal standard graph. So when I increase B, you can see it's following the reflection, the curve of this reflection here, and it's actually the opposite. So I'm not too super concerned about that, but here's B being negative. Look at it follow the reflection of our blue graph. Okay, so I'm not too worried about that. More importantly is on our notes, the next page. So I'm not real concerned about what B does, but the bottom of this page, you guys can go ahead and answer these questions. So I have a question for you, and that'll be on this page. And I'll just answer it in Edpuzzle. I'll have you answer 2 questions in Edpuzzle. All right, folks, hope you like the graph. Sorry this is a little longer, but we'll be prepared for tomorrow. And we will do worksheet 3.4 in class. Thanks.